Very happy to be here. I want to thank Russell for inviting me. So what I'd like to talk about today is HR's role in superior customer service. Now, if you change the trajectory of a cannon by an inch, you just change the position ever so slightly of a cannon, it changes the trajectory of the cannonball by a mile. So in that vein, what I'd like to do is just change your mindset ever so slightly so you have different expectations of your HR people within your organization. So again, we're going to shift the position of the cannon by an inch, and it should change the trajectory of the cannonball by miles, meaning where your company ultimately ends up if you engage your HR department slightly differently. Now, this lecture is about superior customer service, but for many of us, customer service is the leading indicator to retain revenue. For me, it's all about revenue, ultimately. HR does not and should never exist for its own self. It should exist to serve the bottom line. So we have customer service as a leading indicator to revenue. Now, in the past, if you had one happy customer, they would tell a few people, a few friends of their wonderful experience, and of course, conversely, if they had a bad experience, they would tell a few people. But now with social media, Yelp, and whatnot, they will tell hundreds and hundreds, thousands. In fact, they will tell the world. So because of this, I would like to slightly retitle my lecture to HR's role in both obtaining new and sustaining revenue. Okay, let's begin. Now, in the past, going back 70, 80 years ago, if you see the gentleman on the assembly line, it was the people were interchangeable. Back in history, companies competed on their capital. And if, God forbid, a gentleman, a worker, was injured, lost their arm, the people were interchangeable. But if the tools they used broke down, it would stop production. Today, that model has completely reversed itself. Today, all of the tools we use have been commoditized. If you look at any help desk, they're pretty much using the same tools. Many of us are using Excel, we use SAP, we use Oracle, we use Microsoft Office. So think about the implications. If you look at the example of the modern day office, if one of those tools were to break down, they just swap it out for another computer. But if one of your key employees were to leave, not so interchangeable. So we see a complete reversal of the business model. Now, this is especially true for the knowledge economy, because in the knowledge economy, what tools do they really have? The more famous knowledge companies started out in dorm rooms, garages, in very humble beginnings. So what they're really competing on is people. Now, all companies, whether they realize it or not, are HR companies. That's what I'm putting forth. Every company, whether they acknowledge it or not, are human resource companies in how they attract, recruit, select, incentivize, compensate, develop, and even how they exit their people. Let's look at Netflix and Amazon. Netflix runs their infrastructure on Amazon, even though they're competitors, right? They both offer online streaming. However, Amazon does a very good job exiting their employees. So when you have a Netflix employee that used to work for Amazon, Netflix decides that, yes, they're competing with Amazon, but on content, not on infrastructure. So consequently, Amazon gets some very lucrative business from Netflix. So if you look at the chain from attracting to exiting people, companies live and die by the people they hire because, again, all the tools they use have been commoditized. This equation is out of Economics 101. Any MBA student will tell you that this is the equation on how countries and companies measure economic growth. Human capital multiplied by financial capital multiplied by productivity. This equation is pretty much beyond dispute. But let's look at the role of HR. I would say that I own 100% of the first multiplier. I will concede that I owe nothing of the second multiplier. In terms of productivity, well, I'll make the argument a lot of productivity is due to the technology coming in, although I can make the argument that the technology comes from people, but I want to be a little bit more conservative. But I will say at least the other half of productivity I do own. How am I incentivizing my people? Job design, the culture of innovation. So what I'm putting forth is that as an HR person, I feel that I own half of this equation. And when you engage your HR departments knowing that they own half this equation, you'll be having different conversations with them. You'll certainly have different expectations of them. This equation on the board has nothing to do with HR. It has everything to do with business. Now let's look at tangible book value. Or let's look at what a company is worth when they liquidate, when they bankrupt. The first thing, or one of the first things a company does when they liquidate is they exit all of their people and they sell their tangible assets. And yet companies with their people, obviously their market capitalization goes higher. So what causes the gap between tangible book value and market capitalization? Well, it is human capital. And if you look at the S&P 500 index, which was instituted, I believe, in 1956, that gap between book value and market cap keeps widening. It keeps widening because in a knowledge economy, they're not really competing on hard assets. They live and die by their people. Now, I engage a lot of CEOs, and they almost always tell me that people are our most important asset. And yet, we record people as an expense on the income statement. Right? So let's examine that duality. If people are our most important asset, why are they recorded as an expense? Well, if we look at GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles, it really came out of the industrial economy, the manufacturing economy. It was first discussed around 1939, when people competed on their assets. So it's not really suited for today's knowledge economy. Now, what we have to do, what my responsibility is as an HR professional, is to determine how we could measure the return on intellectual capital. When I say measure it, I mean in a dollar amount. Now, if we look at generally accepted accounting principles, why can't my profession develop a generally accepted way to measure intellectual capital? Companies constantly use pro forma financial statements, pro forma balance sheets to analyze potential mergers and acquisitions, certainly for forecasts. So if my profession were to standardize a generally accepted method to measure intellectual capital, it would be represented on a pro forma balance sheet. Because you cannot expect your HR people to improve the return on intellectual capital if they cannot benchmark it. That's why I'd like you to engage your HR people differently, because people and professions often rise to the expectations set forth. So there are a number of equations out there trying to measure intellectual capital, but they're far from standardized. So in the same way that GAAP was standardized to match and audit the manufacturing economy, it's upon my profession to come up with the similar standardized structure to measure intellectual capital. Because after all, the only thing that companies are now competing on, with all of the tools commoditized, are its people. And yet it's the one thing that is neglected on all financial documents. In the same way, the cost of borrowing is reflected on the income statement under interest, but for years, the cost of equity, the cost of capital, was not represented on financial documents, and it's still not. It could only be theorized in a pro forma financial document. So my profession needs to standardize how we can measure intellectual capital. There are two ways to make $1 of net income. One way is to reduce costs by $1, and the other way is to increase revenue by $1. One way is noble, the other lacks vision. Now, my profession for decades contributed to net income by reducing costs by $1. It's not sustaining, and eventually the company would implode. So what my profession needs to do, how I'd like you to engage your own HR people, is to set the expectation for them to be a profit center, not a cost center. This talks about superior customer service. I've linked customer service as the leading indicator to revenue. On this picture, we're talking about that HR has a responsibility to tie itself to revenue and no longer be the single champion for cost containment. When a company is doing poorly, one of the first knee-jerk reactions my profession does is lay people off. But I say, even when the company was doing well, it was never in fashion to have wasted resources, including human resources, no matter how much money the company is making. So a company should always be right-sized. So even if HR has no direct line of sight to revenue, does not mean a relationship does not exist. When I look at big data and I look at algorithms that are becoming more and more sophisticated, it's becoming easier for me to figure out what that relationship is. And I'll reiterate it. Just because HR does not have a direct line of sight to revenue does not mean a relationship does not exist. It's just, have you engaged your HR departments to at least come up with a hypothesis on what that relationship would be? Now, I'd like to talk about your marketing departments and how they engage your customers to bring in revenue. And I'd like to talk about HR rebranding itself as the internal marketing department. Now, administration, admin, is a very important function. In fact, companies could live and die by the efficiency of their admin. However, it incorrectly became intertwined with HR, the birth pains of my profession. And as important as admin is, it's important enough to have its own career path. They certainly have their own professional association, but it is not HR. So I want you to imagine your HR department now rebranded as the internal marketing department, and they market your company to your employees with the same rigor and enthusiasm as your external marketing department markets to your external customers. One of the things that I do when I work with companies, I make sure that the HR department is adjacent to the marketing department. Your external marketing should be completely aligned with your internal marketing. So the conclusion of this object lesson would be, whether or not we actually change the name of the HR department, what if we change the canon by an inch and we rebranded it as the internal marketing department, where they would be focused on evangelizing your employees the same way your external marketing department is tasked with evangelizing your external customers. Now, there's a very famous story. There are 3 people performing the identical task. They're making bricks. But each person views their task in a different way. We ask the first person, "What are you doing?" And he or she will say, "I'm making bricks." We ask the second person what they're doing, and that person may say, "I'm making a wall." We ask the third person what they're doing, and they'll say, "I'm building a cathedral." That person knows where they fit in the value chain. That person has been marketed internally as an employee who's now become an evangelizer. Yes, he's physically making a brick, but he views his role in the grander scheme that he's building a cathedral. Your new internal marketing department that used to be called HR is tapping into the most basic of human instincts, that people want to become a part of something greater than themselves. When Mark Zuckerberg has hackathons and people work twice as many hours in a day, he does not pay them twice as much money. People want to become a part of something greater than themselves. This goes for your customer base, and this should also go for your employees. Your customers fundamentally are purchasing the emotional connection they have to the product or service they're buying. More than actually buying the tangible product or service, they're really buying the emotional connection. And when we use the analogy of a cathedral, the founding CEO has built the cathedral, his or her values. And good HR, they are the cultural guardians of the firm. They are the gargoyles of the cathedral. Now, how would your HR department ensure that they're the gargoyles to the cathedral? How could they ensure that they are guarding the vision and the culture that the founding CEO created? Well, not just qualitatively, but quantitatively, by incentivizing the behaviors that are aligned with the values of the founding CEO, by a good comp plan, by a good incentive plan. I want to use Apple as an example. Customers are really buying the emotional connection to the product or service. That's what I put forth. Pursuant to that point, customers are not buying the what and they're not buying the how. They're really buying the why. What did Apple do? They made a smartphone. How do they do it? Cutting edge technology. But the why is pivotal, because they wanted to change the world, how people interacted. That is how Apple engages their external customers. Your internal marketing department, which used to be called HR, should evangelize with the same rigor and enthusiasm. If you look at the marquee companies, employees join because they want to become a part of something greater than themselves. They join the why, not the what and not the how. Google has so many projects: search, driverless car, and on the cover of Time magazine, maybe about a year ago, they talked about immortality by manipulating stem cells. So think about the diverse portfolio: search, driverless car, eliminating death. So Google does not make one thing. People join Google for the why. And I believe Google gets that more than many companies. What employees do proves that they believe in the why. And the why comes from the culture that the founders created and that HR needs to guard. But again, not just qualitatively, not just with banners, but with proper incentives. Any incentive plan should have two things in common. It should be able to be understood by a 12-year-old, and it should be no more than half a page. The sophistication of a very good incentive plan is in its simplicity, that it is aligned with the behaviors that are aligned with the culture of the company. Every job should be reduced to at least one metric. Because if you start telling people how to do their jobs, you're possibly stifling creativity. If you start measuring high on teamwork, high on a good attitude, my profession, we're not therapists, but if you put a metric, then you let people find their own way. The most ethereal business models inspire social change, and a really good business model will monetize both financial and social profits. So in a world, in the knowledge economy, where all the tools are commoditized and we're only competing on people, we need to engage our HR departments to the same standards as any other department in the business of making money. Now again, there are two ways to make $1 of net income. Increase revenue by $1, decrease costs by $1, and we've made the argument why one is noble and the other lacks vision. But I'm going to put forth another challenge for you to give to your HR departments. Contrary to what many textbooks say, growth is not the strategy. Revenue growth is the tactic. The true strategy is exponential revenue growth. And that could only come from innovation. So now it falls upon my profession, how do we create a culture of innovation where linear revenue growth is merely the tactic? This is an equation that economists use to measure innovation. But as I tell my students, if I cannot explain something to a 12-year-old, I do not understand it enough myself. So here's how this equation works. I want you to imagine a farmer, that every year the farmer uses the same types of seeds and the same amount of land. But every year the yields are different. Why? Because of weather. Because weather exists outside the number of seeds and the amount of land being used, but it changes every year. Well, good innovation does not alter the amount of capital input or labor input. It just engages labor and input differently. So innovation is not about doubling your capital to double your production. You're merely investing more. It's about engaging your people differently, not necessarily hiring even more labor. So whose job is it to create that culture of innovation? Well, it's everyone's job, but I believe that it's HR's job to really lead that. HR is the department with the most balanced agenda. If you look at the EVP of marketing, he or she is concerned about his or her marketing employees more than other employees. And that makes sense. The same goes with IT. But as an HR professional, I'm concerned about all employees equally with HR employees that might work for me. So I have the most balanced agenda. And again, I see my profession as the cultural guardians of the firm. So what HR needs to do is find a better carrot. There's a lot of Skinnerian psychology going on, where you have a food pellet, an electric shock. Human beings could be very complex, but sometimes we're not. So how could we incentivize innovation? Well, if you look at pipelining transformational initiatives, most traditional stagegate processes would kill off most innovations. The return on investments aren't there. And if you're fulfilling a latent customer need, how do you benchmark it? Henry Ford said he never asked his customers what they wanted, because they would have said, you've probably heard this before, they would have said, we want horses that require less water and who could run further without rest. People could not even imagine that they would want and need a horse carriage bereft of a horse. So how could HR incentivize that? Well, again, traditional stage-gate processing uses a metric that is both external and economic. For example, you might engage your sales force and say you must bring in $30 million of revenue. Revenue is an economic metric, and it's certainly external. But for the parts of the business that are engaged in innovation, HR could change the carrot by using the antithesis, the opposite. Instead of looking for an external economic metric, how about an internal one, non-economic? What if you could incentivize the comp plan that as long as a project helped the company learn and not earn, then that project would be funded for the next year, and that employee would have the appropriate bonus or variable pay tied to that metric. Firms must focus on net income. But when you're talking about transformational innovation, just not right away. And usually companies have a mix of innovation of maybe 70% core innovation, 20% adjacent innovation, and 10% transformational. But we need to engage our HR departments to incentivize each one differently. All companies are talent factories. And to reiterate, our tools have become commoditized. People are the last field of competitive advantage. So in that vein, if every company is ultimately an HR department, the CEOs in this room and the business leaders need to hold HR up to the same business standards that you would hold other departments to. I believe that companies will live and die by their HR department, and we've already rebranded your HR department as an internal marketing department. But something I want to say further on the branding of your HR department. The words we use are very important. It conveys a shorthand. And one of the first things that I do when I engage companies is I like to get rid of the name human resources at a minimum. Maybe calling it the internal marketing department is too big of a leap. But resources is something we deplete. Capital is something that we leverage. So when we say resources, that's a shorthand. Human capital at a minimum. Words are powerful things. Again, HR needs to shift itself from a cost center to a profit center. They need to figure out what that indirect line of sight to revenue is, and then they need to incentivize it. And again, if you look at big data, sophisticated algorithms, it's becoming easier and easier for HR to figure out mathematically what that relationship is. And by constantly retweaking the model, they can improve net income. When I look at big data, when I look at social media and its two children, social commerce and social manufacturing from 3D printing, also known as additive manufacturing, even the manufacturing economy is becoming part of the knowledge economy. Now, every supervisor, every manager throughout your company wears an HR hat just by virtue of supervising other people. So if you look at the EVP of marketing, he or she is an HR person, but with marketing expertise. Because even the tools that she uses have become commoditized. The chief technology officer is an HR person, but with technology expertise, because even his or her tools have become commoditized. So if you look at distributive input through MSS systems, management self-service systems, all of these managers are doing the traditional HR functions, the tactical, certainly the transactional. So you will find that your own HR people are slowly being crowded out, what we might call the traditional HR. And that's the evolution of my profession. So the only way for my profession to stay relevant is to acknowledge that either it breaks away from its cost containment, cost center past, embraces its role as a profit center by figuring out their indirect link to revenue, or it will simply be outsourced. When a company decides to outsource something, what they're saying is that they need to accept industry standards for that function, but they're no longer going to compete on that function. If you outsource your payroll, which most of us do, your vendors are not saying, don't worry, we'll treat you better than your competitor who also outsources to us. So HR is getting crowded out of the traditional HR anyway, so why not engage them as your internal marketing department, or at a minimum, your human capital department responsible to use pro forma income statements to measure their own impact on net income. And again, this is the mantra, people are the last field of competitive advantage. Going towards the end of my talk, I'd like to talk about how do we find a competitive advantage on this last field of competitive advantage. If you look at most incentive plans, performance appraisal plans, we will help employees set goals. But there's a different approach, maybe even a little bit contrarian. But remember, every new idea first gets ridiculed, then attacked, and then eventually accepted. See, in the last 9,000 years of recorded human history, here was the paradigm. If I could achieve my goals, I could be successful. And if I could be successful, I could be happy. But that is cognitively broken, because every time we achieve a goal that makes us happy, we simply move the goalpost. So we're not sustaining our happiness just by achieving a goal. If you look at neurobiology, the cognitive sciences, this paradigm is how we're hardwired. If people could start off from a place of happiness that's independent of a specific outcome, but if they start off as happy, then they have a higher probability of achieving their goal. There have been studies about doctors making better diagnoses if labeled as happier, salespeople selling more. So again, the traditional paradigm of if I could achieve my goal, I can be happy is cognitively broken. This is how we're wired. If you start off from a place of happiness, you have a higher probability of achieving your goal, which makes you successful. And if we're talking a business paradigm, it makes the company successful. So what I'm submitting, the ultimate goal of your internal marketing department, because let's face it, your external marketing department wants people to buy your products, not to make them sad, but to make them happy. So why would we allow our internal marketing department not to do the same? Maybe my role is to make sure that my employees start off from a place of happiness, because it will increase the probability of success, which will mean my company will be more successful. Now, I've been to the Google office over on Chelsea. It looks like a very happy place to work, and they get it. Forget about restaurant week. I just want to go to the Google cafeteria. If anyone has ever had the privilege of visiting Google, right? Where's the cash register? There is no cash register. It's amazing. The food's amazing. The environment is amazing. Google already gets it. It's a very happy place to work. And by the way, they measure most of their employees on one metric. And that metric is tied to the values of the original founders. So let's look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. On a micro level, individuals can strive for self-actualization. It also applies on a macro level to companies and even societies. It's hard to self-actualize when you're not happy or when you're worried about paying the rent. And what I try to do is discover the link between my employees' path to self-actualization and my company's path to self-actualization. I do not want to spend $10 to fix a $2 problem. In order for it to be sustainable, it must contribute to net income through pushing up revenue. Now, if you look at today's work environment, there are blurred lines between personal life and a business life. Telecommunication technology makes physical space superfluous. If you receive an email at 9, 10 o'clock at night, there's every expectation it should be answered before the next day. So there's a lot going on. It's hard to create a climate of happiness so you have a higher probability of achieving goals if HR can't figure out the right formula. Yes, you need to put out fires, but if you're only putting out fires, then it's at the risk of your long-term growth. Quick story, I spent a huge swath of my adult life in Asia. And many of the companies, they were family dynasties, they would have ops reviews where they would talk about the next quarter century. And then I came to America, and I would be on investment calls, ops reviews, where they would literally talk about the next quarter, the next 3 months. And certainly, if you're only looking at long-term growth, you might run out of cash flow to keep your lights on. So there has to be a balance. But HR can get this right. So here's the paradigm. We have HR, which I say is the cultural guardian of the firm, the gargoyles to the cathedral that the CEO built. And now we have them incentivizing behaviors so their employees, who are now really have been evangelized, they could now offer superior customer service. And if you notice, I don't stop at superior customer service, I stop at revenue, because I don't want to spend $10 on offering superior customer service if it's going to yield me less than $10 in revenue. It's just not sustainable over the long run. Now, HR's role, how I would like you to engage them, is to challenge them to merge the qualitative and the quantitative. I am not in the business of making people happy for their own sake. I do put forth that happier employees have a higher probability of success. But your HR department needs to define that success in the business metric of superior customer service leading to revenue. And as long as you define success in an appropriate business metric, you could constantly retweak the model to ensure that it's sustainable. Now, employees cannot self-actualize if they're constantly worried about many non-value-added items. And for employees to self-actualize, or at least go towards that path, they need to have purpose. Many of us find that purpose in our personal life, as it should be. But the marquee companies also offer employees a purpose. And that's what leads them towards a path of self-actualization. So HR should internally market to their employees so the employees actually become evangelizes. Again, we go back to the why. This is why your customers purchase your product or service. The more they believe in the why, the more loyalty, and the more they're willing to forgive faux pas. Because the best businesses do have risks that manifest. If your customers are only buying the what or the how, the first time that runs afoul, you lose your retained revenue. But if they believe in the why, they'll stick around a little bit more. They'll give you time to figure it out. So let's have HR also realize the employees that are more willing to stay, and not necessarily if you have a comp plan that leads the market, are the employees that get the why. Because again, people want to become a part of something greater than themselves. Money will only motivate you so much. If I pay you twice as much, you're not going to work twice as hard. So the paradigm that I'm putting forth as we close is that your employees are now your evangelizes, and the customers will interact with those employees, and they'll want to model the employee behavior. I see customers in the Apple store, and the customers want to emulate some of that behavior. They enjoy learning about the product so they can help their friends and almost be considered gurus in Apple the same way the employees are. So if the employees get the why, and they live in the cathedral that the CEO built, then customers get to sense what it's like just by visiting that cathedral. They get to sense what it's like to live there just by engaging in your employees, which, because of internal marketing, are really evangelizing your product or service. Now, any interaction that your customers have with your company is either going to be positive or negative. The odds of it being completely neutral is like flipping a coin and having the coin land on its side. Possible but not probable. And often it's not extremely negative or extremely positive, but it's usually more one than the other. So we're putting forth that people are really buying the emotional connection to your company. So they need to get the why, and HR needs to market internally the same way your marketing department markets to your external customers. Now, because we've evangelized our employees, they become our brand ambassadors. You could take any company and Google "I hate" and type in the name of the company, and you'll get a litany of people with grievances. But when HR engages its employees with the same care that your external marketing department engages your external customers, well, as brand ambassadors and social media as the megaphone for your employees, you can influence a little bit more where that megaphone is pointed and what things are coming out of that megaphone. I do want to say that there are no HR problems. We do not exist for our own sake. There are only revenue issues, there are only business problems with HR solutions. We want to get away of just spending money to improve morale if it's not going to add to shareholder value. And that concludes my talk today, and I thank you very much. Russell, thank you so much for having me.